My name is Jenny Shelton, and I'm 35. This Christmas dinner changed everything. I walked into my brother's house, arms full of a gift I thought would finally make them see me. But then he said it loud and clear over the clinking glasses. Kids don't belong here. He wasn't talking about children. He meant me. My mother's face tightened, her eyes darting away. The rest of the table laughed, their voices sharp, slicing through me. I'd spent years pouring money into their lives, paying off debts, funding their dreams. Yet here, I was invisible again. I swallowed the sting, sat down, and forced a smile, but his words burned. They didn't know about the investment I'd made, the one propping up his so-called success. I'd planned to reveal it that night to show I was more than the kid he mocked. But as the laughter echoed, something snapped. I grabbed my gift, walked out, and set it ablaze in the backyard fire pit. 30 minutes later, when they realized what I'd burned and what it meant for them, they begged me to take back my words. I just smiled. That night, I learned where I truly belonged. Want to know what I burned and why it broke them? Stick around. This story is worth it. Snow dusted the streets as I pulled into Curtis' driveway in Little Rock. I clutched the wrapped gift in my hands, my heart heavy with hope. This wasn't just a present. It was my chance to shift how Curtis and his family saw me. I'd poured so much into them, from money to time, believing this gift would finally make them acknowledge my place. I stepped out of the car, the chill biting my fingers, and walked up to the house, the faint hum of holiday music spilling through the windows. Inside, the dining room buzzed with chatter. Curtis, my brother, stood at the head of the table, gesturing wildly as he told a story. His girlfriend sat beside him, nodding along, her smile tight. My mother was arranging napkins, her movements slow and deliberate. My nephew hunched over his phone, didn't look up as I entered. I scanned the table for my seat, expecting my name on one of the neatly folded place cards. Nothing. Not a single card bore Jenny Shelton. My stomach twisted. I'd paid for the food roast turkey cranberry sauce, bottles of Merlot, and even sent money for the decorations, the twinkling lights and holly wreaths they'd gushed about. Yet no seat for me. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile, holding up the gift. "Where should I sit?" Curtis glanced over his eyes, flicking to the package. "Oh, just grab a chair from the kitchen," he said, waving a hand like it was no big deal. His girlfriend's gaze slid past me, landing on the dessert tray instead. My mother adjusted a fork, avoiding my eyes. My nephew didn't lift his head from his screen. I stood there, the gift growing heavier in my arms, the room's warmth, doing nothing to thaw the cold settling in my chest. I set the gift on a side table, telling myself it was a mistake, an oversight. I dragged a folding chair from the kitchen, its metal frame creaking as I wedged it between two guests. My cousin Shaw Harper gave me a quick nod. "Good to see you," he said, his voice warm but distracted as he checked his phone. I tried to join the conversation, asking about his new job, but the table's focus stayed on Curtis's anecdotes. He was mid-story about a big client, his voice booming, and I caught his girlfriend rolling her eyes when I tried to chime in. "So," Jenny Shaw said, leaning over, still killing it at work. I nodded, grateful for the lifeline. "Yeah, keeping busy," I said. But my words drowned in the clatter of plates. Curtis cut in, talking over me about his latest project, something about a deal that could change everything. I bit my lip, thinking of the gift of what it represented. I'd sunk so much into his dreams, believing this night would be different. But as I sat on that creaky chair, the table crowded with plates I'd paid for, I felt like a guest in my own family. My mother finally looked my way, her expression soft but distant. "You okay, dear?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the laughter. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Fine," I said, but the word tasted bitter. My nephew swiped at his phone, oblivious. Curtis's girlfriend reached for another glass of wine I'd chosen. I glanced at the gift on the side table, still untouched, and a quiet anger stirred. They didn't see me. Not really. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I'd wait for the right moment to show them what I'd brought, what I'd done for them. Maybe then they'd understand. The meal went on, and I tried to blend in passing dishes, forcing laughs at jokes I barely heard. Sean asked about my latest project, and I started to answer, but Curtis's voice overpowered mine again, pulling the room's attention back to him. His girlfriend smirked, like my attempt to speak was some kind of intrusion. My mother offered a faint smile, then turned to fuss over the centerpiece. My nephew didn't look up once. I gripped the edge of my chair, the metal cold under my fingers, and felt the weight of being overlooked press harder. The gift sat there, a silent promise I still clung to, but doubt crept in. Would they ever see me the way I wanted? As the plates emptied, Curtis stood to pour more wine, his laughter filling the room. I watched him, the man I'd bailed out time and again, acting like he'd built this night himself. I thought of the hours I'd spent planning the money I'd sent, the hope I'd pinned on that gift, and still no seat with my name, no place for me. My chest tightened, but I pushed it down. The night wasn't over. I'd give them one more chance to see me, really see me, before I decided what came next. By the fireplace, memories of my efforts came rushing back. I stood there, the chatter of the Christmas dinner fading behind me, and thought about everything I'd done for Curtis and his family. It wasn't just about the gift I'd brought tonight, it was the years of quietly carrying their burdens, believing one day they'd see me as more than the family bank account. Last spring, Curtis called me late at night, his voice tight with panic. He'd racked up $3,000 in credit card debt, missed payments piling up, and begged for help to avoid losing his car. I wired the money the next day, no questions asked, even though it meant dipping into my savings. He promised to pay me back, but months passed, and all I got was a half-hearted thanks over text. I didn't push him. I thought covering his debt would show him I was there for him, that I was family, not just a checkbook. Then there was Ethan, my nephew. He'd been picked for a regional basketball tournament in Dallas, a big deal for a 16-year-old. The team needed travel funds, and Curtis couldn't cover it. I bought Ethan's plane ticket, $500 round trip, and sent extra for meals and gear. Ethan sent a quick appreciate it message, but when I asked how the tournament went, he never replied. I told myself he was just a kid caught up in his world, but it stung. I'd hoped that gesture would mean something, maybe earn me a place in their lives beyond being the aunt who paid for things. The biggest sacrifice was the investment. 6 months ago, Curtis was pitching his startup to anyone who'd listen a news platform he swore would change the game. He needed capital to keep it afloat. And I believed in him, or at least in the idea of him succeeding. I didn't want credit. I wanted him to thrive, to see me as someone who lifted him up. I spent late nights reviewing his business plan, offering feedback. He brushed off saying I didn't get the vision. Still, I stayed quiet, hoping my support would speak louder than his dismissals. But Curtis never saw it. Last month at a family barbecue, he'd called me the money machine in front of everyone, laughing like it was a joke. "Jenny's got no life outside work," he said, tossing back a beer. Vivian smiled faintly, saying nothing. Ethan smirked eyes on his phone. I laughed it off then, but the words cut deep. I'd given so much money, time, belief yet to Curtis. I was just the money machine, not a sister, not someone who mattered. Standing by the fireplace, those moments played like a loop in my head. The debt I'd cleared, the ticket I'd bought, the investment I'd hidden, all for what? To sit on a folding chair at a table with no place card for me. I gripped my glass, the wine I'd paid for tasting sour now. I'd done everything to prove my worth, to carve out a space in this family. But Curtis's words from that barbecue echoed louder than the holiday music around me. He didn't see my sacrifices. He saw dollar signs. Anger simmered slow and heavy, but I pushed it down. I wasn't ready to give up on them yet. The gift I'd brought tonight was still on the side table, untouched. Maybe when Curtis opened it, he'd understand what I'd done for him. Maybe Vivian would look at me with pride, not that distant pity. Maybe Ethan would put down his phone long enough to say something real. I took a deep breath and turned back to the table, forcing myself to rejoin the laughter, the clinking plates, the conversations that didn't include me. I passed a dish of mashed potatoes to Sean, trying to catch his eye, but he was talking to Renee about some TV show. Vivian fussed with her napkin, avoiding my gaze again. Ethan swiped at his screen, oblivious to the spread I'd funded. Curtis stood launching into another story, his voice drowning out the room. I sat back, my chair creaking, and felt the weight of my efforts pressing harder. I'd given so much, but it was never enough. Not for them, not yet. The fire crackled behind me, and I glanced at the gift again, its wrapping catching the light. I'd pinned so much hope on it on this night, but as Curtis's laughter rang out, I wondered if hope was all I had left. I told myself to stay, to keep trying. The night was young, and I still believed I could change their minds. For now, I'd play my part. Smile through the ache and wait for the moment to show them who I really was. Dinner hummed along when Curtis stood, glass raised. The room quieted Forks, pausing midair as he cleared his throat with a theatrical flourish. I leaned back in my creaky folding chair, watching him command the table like a king. His grin was wide, almost smug, as he launched into a speech about gratitude and family. This Christmas, he said, I want to thank everyone who's been there for me. Vivian for her wisdom, Ethan for keeping me grounded, Renee for pushing me forward. He raised his glass higher, and the table clapped their smiles warm and wide. My name didn't cross his lips. Not a word about the money I'd poured into his life, the support that kept his dreams afloat. I sat there invisible, my fingers tightening around my napkin. Curtis wasn't done. He set his glass down and leaned forward, eyes gleaming. And I've got big news, he said, pausing for effect. My startup just landed a deal, $500,000 signed and sealed. This is the break we've been waiting for. The table erupted. Vivian beamed, clapping her hands. Ethan looked up from his phone, nodding with rare enthusiasm. Renee squeezed Curtis's arm, her laughter bright. Sean raised his glass, shouting to the big shot Uncle Gerald sitting at the far end, let out a whistle. I forced a smile, but my chest burned. That deal. He didn't know it, but it was my money, my investment that had paved the way for it. I'd stayed silent, hoping he'd see my worth on his own, but he didn't even glance my way. I waited for a mention, a hint, anything to acknowledge what I'd done. Instead, Curtis basked in the praise, recounting how he'd hustled to secure the contract, how his vision had finally paid off. It's all about persistence, he said as if I'd had no part in it, Vivian chimed in. I always knew you'd make it, Ethan muttered. Pretty cool. Before his eyes flicked back to his screen, Renee leaned closer to Curtis, whispering something that made him laugh. The room buzzed with excitement, their voices blending into a chorus of admiration. I sat there, the food I'd paid for sitting heavy in my stomach, feeling like I'd been erased. The sting of being overlooked wasn't new, but this cut deeper. I'd spent years propping Curtis up, believing my sacrifices would earn me a place at this table. Not just a seat, but a real place. I thought of the late nights I'd spent wiring money, reviewing his business plans, swallowing his dismissals. For what? To watch him take credit for my work, to hear him thank everyone but me. My hands shook as I reached for my glass, the wine bitter on my tongue. I wanted to stand to shout that his precious deal wouldn't exist without me, but I didn't. I sat there silent, the weight of my silence crushing me. The conversation shifted guests, toasting Curtis's success, swapping stories about his genius. Sean asked him about the deal's details, and Curtis rattled off numbers and names, each word a reminder of my invisible role. Renee bragged about how she'd helped him prep for the pitch, as if her pep talks were the key. Vivian nodded proudly, saying, That's my boy. Ethan, for once, put his phone down to ask about the new office Curtis was planning. I tried to join in asking a question about the timeline, but my voice barely carried. Renee cut me off mid-sentence, turning to Curtis with another question. No one noticed. I looked around the table at the faces lit with pride for Curtis and realized something cold and sharp. I wasn't part of this family. Not the way I'd hoped. They saw Curtis as the star, the one who'd made it, while I was just the shadow who paid the bills. The gift I'd brought, still untouched, on the side table, felt like a foolish dream now. I'd thought it would change things, make them see me. But as Curtis raised another toast, his eyes skipping over me, I felt like a stranger in a room full of people I'd given everything to. The party carried on louder now, with laughter and clinking glasses. I pushed my plate away the food untouched. Sean tried to pull me into a side conversation, asking about my job, but I could barely focus. His kindness felt like pity, and I didn't want it. Vivian glanced at me once, her eyes soft but fleeting, before turning back to Curtis. Ethan was back on his phone, oblivious. Renee's hand stayed on Curtis's arm, her smile territorial. I sat there, surrounded by noise, but more alone than I had ever felt. The ache in my chest grew, not just anger now, but a dawning clarity. I wasn't one of them. Maybe I never had been. As Curtis launched into another story, his voice booming, I stared at my hands folded tightly in my lap. The table's joy felt like a wall shutting me out. After the toast, I noticed the place cards on the table. The dinner plates were mostly cleared, and the room buzzed with post-batch chatter, but something caught my eye. I leaned forward, scanning the neatly folded cards that marked everyone's seats. My heart stopped when I saw it. One card tucked near the centerpiece didn't read Jenny Shelton. It read Jenny Dawson. Dawson, my married name, from a brief failed marriage I'd left behind years ago. I hadn't used that name in a decade, and I'd made it clear to everyone it was no longer mine. Yet there it was, staring back at me, a reminder of a past I'd buried. I reached for the card, my fingers brushing the crisp paper. Curtis caught my movement and glanced over, a smirk tugging at his lips. "What's wrong, Jenny?" he asked, his tone light, but edged with amusement. "Oh," Thaddy said, waving a hand at the card. "Just a small mix-up. No big deal." His laugh was sharp, cutting through the hum of conversation. Renee, sitting beside him, stifled a giggle, her eyes glinting with something that felt like mockery. I forced a tight smile, but the air in the room seemed to thin. A small mix-up. They knew my name. They knew my history. This wasn't an accident. It was a jab. Another way to remind me I didn't quite belong. I pushed my chair back and started clearing plates, needing something to do with my hands. The clatter of dishes drowned out the laughter, but not the sting. As I stacked plates in the kitchen, Curtis's voice carried from the dining room. "Look at Jenny. Always so good at the little chores," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Renee's laugh followed, bright and cruel. "Yeah, she's got that down," she added, as if I were some hired help, not family. My grip tightened on a plate, the porcelain cold against my palms. I'd paid for this meal, the wine, the decorations, and yet here I was reduced to good at chores in their eyes. Back at the table, I kept moving, gathering silverware, avoiding eyes. Vivian was rearranging the centerpiece, her silence louder than words. Ethan swiped at his phone, oblivious, as always. Sean, stacking his own plate, paused and picked up the card with Jenny Dawson written on it. "Hey, Jenny," he said, his voice curious but gentle. "What's with this Dawson? Didn't you change back to Shelton years ago?" The table went quiet for a moment, all eyes on me. Curtis shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Like I said, just a typo." He set his grin wider now. Renee snorted, covering her mouth. I felt heat rise in my chest, a mix of shame and fury. Sean's question wasn't meant to hurt, but it laid bare the truth. They didn't care enough to get my name right. I set the plates down harder than I meant to, the clink echoing. "It's not a typo," I said, my voice low but steady. "You all know my name." Curtis raised an eyebrow, still smirking. "Relax, Jenny." "It's just a card," he said, as if I were overreacting. Renee leaned into him, whispering something that made them both chuckle. Vivian looked at me briefly, her lips parting as if to speak, but then she turned away, fussing with a napkin. Ethan didn't even glance up. The room's warmth felt suffocating now, the holiday lights mocking me with their cheer. I'd spent years trying to be part of this family, but that card, that deliberate mistake, felt like a line drawn in the sand. I kept clearing the table. My movements mechanical, but inside anger was boiling over. Curtis's words, his casual dismissal, echoed in my head. Good at chores. Just a typo. Each phrase was a needle pricking at the hope I'd clung to all night. I thought of the gift still sitting on the side table, the one I'd believed would make them see me. Now it felt like a relic of my own naivety. I'd given them everything, money, time, faith, and they couldn't even get my name right. Sean tried to lighten the mood, asking about my work again, but his words barely reached me. I nodded, mumbled a reply, and kept moving the weight of their disregard, pressing harder. As I carried a stack of dishes to the kitchen, Curtis called out, "Don't work too hard, Jenny. Leave some chores for the rest of us." Another laugh from Renee followed, sharp and grating. I paused in the doorway, my back to the table, my hands trembling. The urge to turn around to call them out was overwhelming, but I didn't. Not yet. I set the dishes in the sink and took a breath, trying to steady myself. The night was unraveling, and so was my patience. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay silent, but for now, I'd keep going one step at a time until I knew what to do next. I slipped into the living room where Christmas lights glowed. The dining room's chatter faded behind me as I sought a moment of quiet, my hands still unsteady from the sting of the wrong name on that place card. The gift I'd brought, a carefully wrapped copy of the investment contract I'd signed for Curtis's startup, sat on the side table where I'd left it hours ago, but now it wasn't neatly placed. It was shoved into a corner, half buried under a pile of discarded napkins and empty wine glasses. Its ribbon crumpled. It hadn't been opened. Curtis hadn't even bothered to look at it. My breath caught a sharp pain slicing through me. That contract, my silent sacrifice, was nothing more than trash to him. I picked it up, smoothing the ribbon with trembling fingers. I'd spent weeks preparing it, choosing the wrapping to make it special, hoping it would be the moment they'd finally see me. $500,000 of my own money poured into his dream, and he'd tossed it aside like it meant nothing. The living room felt colder now, the twinkling lights casting long shadows that seemed to mock my effort. I clutched the package, my chest tight with a mix of hurt and rage, and turned back toward the dining room where the party was still in full swing. Viven's voice carried as I approached. "Curtis, you outdid yourself with this party." She said, her tone warm with pride. "The food, the decorations, everything's perfect." I froze in the doorway, the gift heavy in my arms. Perfect. I'd paid for the roast turkey, the cranberry sauce, the holly wreath she was gushing over. I'd wired the money for those twinkling lights, chosen the wine they were drinking. But Vivian didn't mention me. Not a word about my contributions, as if Curtis had conjured this night single-handedly. He laughed, accepting her praise without hesitation. "Yeah, I wanted it to be special," he said, his voice smug. Renee leaned into him, nodding, her smile wide. I stood there, unseen the truth of my role, swallowed by their applause. Ethan was sprawled in his chair, thumb swiping across his phone, as indifferent as ever. I glanced at the gift in my hands, hoping for a flicker of interest from him, something to show he cared. But he didn't look up, not even when I stepped closer to the table. The contract inside that wrapping was my attempt to bridge the gap, to show them I was more than the aunt who sent checks. I'd imagined Ethan might ask about it, maybe even thank me for believing in his father's dream. Instead, he scrolled through his screen, lost in a world that didn't include me. The realization hit hard. My efforts, my hope, were invisible to him, too. I set the gift back on the side table, its crumpled ribbon, a silent accusation. The room buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. But I felt like I was standing outside it all, watching through a glass wall. I'd given everything, my savings, my time, my heart to this family, and they didn't even see it. Curtis hadn't opened the gift. Vivian credited him for my work. Ethan couldn't be bothered to look up. The weight of their disregard settled into my bones heavier than ever. I'd come to this party hoping to belong, but every moment pushed me further away. Anger surged hotter and sharper than before until it felt like it might spill over. I wanted to grab the gift, shove it in Curtis's face, and demand he acknowledge what I'd done. I wanted to tell Vivian the truth about who'd paid for her perfect night. I wanted to shake Ethan and ask why he couldn't spare me a glance, but I didn't. I stood there, my hands clenched at my sides, the fire in my chest burning brighter with every second. This wasn't just about the gift. It was about years of being overlooked, of pouring myself into a family that didn't care. Sean appeared beside me, holding a plate of dessert. "You okay, Jenny?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. I nodded, forcing a smile, but it felt brittle. "Just taking a break," I said, my words barely audible over the party's noise. He hesitated, then gestured to the gift. "That yours looks important." I swallowed hard, the question stinging more than he could know. "It was," I said, my voice flat. He didn't press, just gave me a small nod and rejoined the table. I stayed where I was, staring at the gift. Its wrapping now a symbol of my misplaced faith. The party carried on, oblivious to me. Curtis was telling another story, his voice booming. Vivian laughed, her hand resting on his arm. Renee poured more wine, her eyes bright with amusement. Ethan's phone glowed, his focus unbroken. I looked at them, this family I'd tried so hard to be part of, and felt something break inside me. The anger wasn't just anger anymore, it was clarity. I was done chasing their approval. The gift discarded and ignored was the final proof. I wasn't one of them, and maybe I never would be. For the first time that night, I felt the weight of that truth, and it was heavier than any sacrifice I'd made. Laughter filled the room. I stood by the side table, the crumpled gift in my hands, its weight heavier than ever. Their laughter wasn't just amusement. It was a wall shutting me out, marking me as less than family. I set the gift down my hand, steady, now fueled by a resolve I hadn't felt all evening. I stepped toward the table, picked up the wrapped contract, and held it high. "This," I said, my voice cutting through their mirth, "is the investment contract for Curtis's startup. $500,000 from me." The room went silent, forks clinking to a stop. Curtis's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing. Vivian's brow furrowed, her hand stilling on her glass. Ethan looked up, confused, his phone forgotten for once. Renee tilted her head, her smile twitching. "You're joking, right?" she said, her tone laced with disbelief. Curtis leaned back, crossing his arms. "Come on, Jenny." "Don't make a scene," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I didn't flinch. "I'm not joking," I said, tearing the wrapping to reveal the contract's cover page, its title bold and unmistakable. "I funded your dream, Curtis. Every cent of that deal you bragged about came from me." The table stayed quiet, their faces a mix of shock and doubt. Vivian opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting to Curtis. Ethan muttered, "No way," under his breath. Renee laughed sharp and dismissive. You're saying you're the big investor?" she asked as if the idea were absurd. Curtis shook his head, chuckling. "Nice try, Jenny. You're not that kind of player." Their words stung, but I was done letting them define me. I turned and walked out the back door, the contract clutched tightly in my hand. The cold night air hit me as I stepped into the yard where a small outdoor fireplace glowed, its flames steady and contained. I didn't hesitate. I tossed the contract into the fire, watching the pages curl and blacken the ink of my sacrifice vanishing in sparks. The act felt final, like shedding a weight I'd carried too long. I pulled out my phone, opened in my email, and typed a message to the investment firm. "Withdraw my funding for Curtis Floyd's startup effective immediately." I hit send, my heart pounding but clear. This was my line in the sand. Back inside, the family was still at the table, their voices quieter now, uncertain. I stood in the doorway watching them. Curtis was talking, trying to regain control, dismissing my claim as drama. Renee nodded, rolling her eyes. Vivian looked uneasy, but said nothing. Ethan was back on his phone, detached. Then my phone buzzed 30 minutes after my email. A reply from the firm funding withdrawal confirmed. Contract terminated. I read it aloud, my voice steady, cutting through their chatter. "It's done," I said. "Your deal, Curtis, is gone." The room froze. Curtis's face palled, his mouth open but wordless. Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Jenny, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Renee stared, her smirk gone, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Ethan dropped his phone, his eyes locked on me, finally seeing me. Sean, who'd been silent, looked from me to Curtis, his expression unreadable. The laughter was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that felt like victory. For the first time that night, I wasn't invisible. I met Curtis's gaze. His confidence shattered, and a small, quiet smile curved my lips. They didn't understand, not fully. They thought I was bluffing, that I'd back down, that I'd stay the quiet sister who paid the bills. But I wasn't that person anymore. The fire outside had burned more than paper. It had burned my need for their approval. I'd given them everything, and they'd given me nothing but scorn. Now they'd feel the cost of that. Curtis stammered. "You can't. You wouldn't." But I cut him off. "I did," I said, my voice calm but firm. I turned, leaving them in their shock, and stepped back into the night, the cold air sharp against my skin. For the first time, I felt free. The next morning, Laura's message lit up my phone. "Jenny, it's Laura Harper, your former sister-in-law." The text read, "Curtis has been using you for years, taking your money, your time, without a shred of gratitude. I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner." I sat at my kitchen table, coffee cooling in my mug, staring at her words. Laura had been married to Curtis for a decade before their divorce, and she'd seen his patterns up close. Her message wasn't a surprise, but it was a confirmation, a sharp, clear lens on the truth I'd ignored for too long. Curtis hadn't just overlooked me. He'd built his success on my sacrifices, and I'd let him. A few weeks later, news broke that Curtis's startup had collapsed. Without my $500,000 investment, the company couldn't secure other backers. Suppliers pulled out and clients vanished. I read about it in a local business journal. The headline, Cold and Final Floyd Tech Declares Bankruptcy. My phone rang that same day. Curtis's name flashing on the screen. His voice was strained, almost unrecognizable. "Jenny, I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out. "I didn't mean to take you for granted. Can we talk? I need your help." I listened, my heart steady, no longer swayed by his pleas. "No," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You made your choices. I'm done." I hung up the silence that followed, feeling like a door closing for good. I didn't stop there. The money I'd saved, the funds I'd once poured into Curtis's dreams, needed a new purpose. I researched for days, looking for something that mattered. I found a scholarship fund for women in technology, a program helping young women break into a field where they were often overlooked. I donated every cent of my remaining savings, $300,000 to the fund, setting up a grant in my name, the Jenny Shelton Scholarship. It wasn't about recognition. It was about giving others the chance I'd fought for a chance to be seen. When the fund's director called to thank me, her voice warm with gratitude, I felt a spark of pride I hadn't known in years. This was my work, my choice, not theirs. Looking back, I saw the lesson carved into every moment of that Christmas night. Family isn't about one-sided sacrifice, about pouring yourself empty for people who don't care. It's about mutual respect, and I'd forgotten that. I'd spent years chasing approval, thinking love meant giving everything, my money, my time, my heart. But love doesn't demand you erase yourself. Self-respect means living for your own purpose, not someone else's. That night when I burned the contract and walked away, I wasn't just cutting ties with Curtis. I was choosing myself. I stopped answering their calls. Vivian left voicemails, her tone hesitant, asking me to come around. Renee sent a text half apologizing, half defensive, claiming I'd overreacted. Ethan never reached out his silence as loud as his indifference. Sean sent a kind message checking in, but even he couldn't bridge the gap. I didn't block them, but I didn't respond either. I packed away the holiday decorations in my apartment, the ones I'd bought for their party, and felt lighter with every box I sealed. Little Rock still hummed outside my window, but it felt different now. A city I could belong to on my own terms. I started small, rebuilding my life. I took a coding boot camp, something I'd always wanted to try, but never prioritized. The late nights studying the challenge of learning something new gave me a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I joined a local women's tech group, meeting others who shared my drive, who saw me for who I was, not who I could bankroll. My apartment became a space of my own filled with books and plants, not reminders of a family that didn't value me. For the first time, I wasn't living for their approval. I was living for me. The scholarship fund sent me update stories of the women it supported. One, a single mother studying cybersecurity, wrote a letter thanking me for her chance to build a future. I read it on a quiet evening, the words sinking in. This was what mattered. Impact, not applause. Curtis's bankruptcy, their shock, their apologies. They were echoes of a life I'd left behind. I didn't need their validation anymore. Family wasn't the one I was born into. It was the one I'd build with people who saw my worth. I looked out at the city lights, my reflection steady in the glass, and knew I'd finally found my place.